Imagine a piece of land bigger than the city of Chicago, where no human is allowed to live. Not for a few years, not for a decade, for generations. In 1986, a nuclear reactor in Chernobyl exploded, and in a matter of days, an entire region was evacuated and sealed off. Towns, schools, farms, all of it just left behind. You'd think a place like that would stay dead forever. But here's the strange part almost nobody talks about. Walk through that same exclusion zone today, and you won't find silence. You'll find horses. Wild horses, running free across overgrown fields, sheltering in collapsed buildings, raising their young in a landscape humans were forced to abandon. And these aren't just any horses. They're one of the rarest, toughest breeds on the planet, a species that once went completely extinct in the wild. Someone brought them here, into the most dangerous land in Europe, almost as an experiment. Nobody was sure it would work. What happened next is something even the scientists studying this place call a small miracle. So how exactly did a radioactive dead zone turn into one of the last truly wild places left in Europe? Stick around, it gets better. Here's the part most people don't know. Przewalski's horses aren't just wild horses in the casual sense. They're a separate ancient lineage, stocky, sandy-colored, almost toy-like animals with a thicker build and a stiff, upright mane, nothing like the horses you'd see on a ranch. By the late 1960s, they were gone from the wild entirely. Hunting, habitat loss, competition with livestock, it all added up until the very last wild one was spotted in the Mongolian desert in 1969. After that, every single Przewalski's horse left on Earth lived behind a fence. The entire species was hanging on through a small handful of zoo populations, and for a while, it wasn't clear that would be enough. Now fast forward to 1998. Chernobyl had been empty of people for over a decade by then, and a group of conservationists noticed something interesting. Without farming, without traffic, without hunting, the land inside the exclusion zone was quietly turning back into open grassland and forest. Exactly the kind of terrain this horse used to roam before it disappeared. So they made a bold call. They loaded roughly 30 of these horses onto trucks and released them straight into the most contaminated landscape in Europe. Here's the twist almost nobody mentions. It nearly fell apart immediately. Several horses didn't survive the stress of transport and release at all. The ones that did had to figure out, completely on their own, how to survive in a place no one had studied this species living in before. Deep forest instead of open steppe. Abandoned villages instead of empty plains. For a moment, it looked like the whole experiment might just quietly fail, but it didn't. Within a few years, foals started appearing, then more. The herd that had started as a handful of frightened, displaced animals began doing something nobody had fully expected, not just surviving the radioactive landscape, but breeding, growing, building family groups inside it. By the early 2000s, their numbers had more than doubled. For a species that had vanished from the wild completely just 30 years earlier, that wasn't just survival. That was the beginning of something nobody had managed to pull off anywhere else on the planet. You said, continue, but again, remember. Now here's where the story takes a turn nobody who only knows the headline version expects. For a few years, after the horses arrived, everything looked like a quiet success story. The herd kept growing, foals kept being born, and it seemed like Chernobyl might genuinely become a safe haven for a species that almost vanished from the Earth. Then, sometime around 2004, things started going wrong, and not because of radiation. It was people. Despite the exclusion zone being one of the most restricted areas on the planet, poachers found their way in. Over the following 2 years, the horse population was hit hard. Some herds lost members faster than new foals could replace them. By 2007, the population that had once peaked at around 65 horses had been cut down to roughly 50. For a species with such a small genetic pool to begin with, remember every Przewalski's horse alive today descends from just a dozen or so individuals that survived in zoos. Losing animals this way wasn't just sad, it put the entire Chernobyl population back at risk of collapse. This is the moment that could have ended the experiment for good. But instead, Ukrainian authorities tightened security across the zone, increased penalties for illegal entry, and stepped up patrols specifically to protect what was left of the herd. And slowly, the horses started doing what they do best, adapting. Here's the part that genuinely surprised the scientists tracking them. Przewalski's horses are a steppe species. Their entire evolutionary history is built around open grassland, wide open sightlines, nowhere to hide and nowhere to be ambushed. Chernobyl wasn't open grassland anymore. Decades without human activity had let forests creep back in everywhere, including some of the most contaminated patches of land in the entire zone, an area researchers grimly call the Red Forest. By every expectation, that should have been the one place these horses avoided. Instead, camera traps caught them moving through it anyway, weaving between the trees, even using it as cover. Researchers found something even stranger when they checked footage from abandoned villages scattered across the zone, horses ducking into collapsed barns and empty houses, using the crumbling structures to escape storms and biting insects, sometimes bedding down for the night inside rooms where families once lived. And they weren't alone out there. As the years went on, camera traps started picking up wolves moving through the same forests. Then lynx, a species so rare in this part of Europe that spotting one is considered a rare event for any wildlife researcher. Then, almost unbelievably, brown bears, an animal that hadn't been confirmed in this region in over 100 years. One by one, species that had been pushed out of Europe for generations were quietly finding their way back into the one place humans had been forced to leave behind. By 2018, 20 years after that first shaky release, researchers carrying out a full census counted roughly 150 Przewalskis horses living wild across the Ukrainian side of the zone alone, organized into more than a dozen family herds, each built around a single stallion, several mares, and their young, with separate bands of younger males roaming on their own. The population that nearly collapsed under poaching less than 15 years earlier had tripled. The zone's lead nature scientist later put it about as plainly as anyone could. With humans gone, he said, the land had effectively performed something like a factory reset. Forests and rivers and grasslands that had spent decades being farmed, paved, and built on were quietly returning to something closer to what they looked like centuries ago. And right in the middle of that reset, a species that had completely disappeared from the wild was rebuilding itself, one foal at a time, inside the most unlikely sanctuary anyone could have imagined. By now, you'd think the story would settle into something simple. Humans left, nature came back, happy ending. But the real picture inside that exclusion zone is messier and far more interesting than that. And it's worth understanding before you decide what this place actually means. Here's the twist scientists are still wrestling with. Nobody really knows, even now, exactly how the radiation is affecting these horses long term. Researchers have been studying everything from their teeth to their gut parasites to their reproductive rates for over 2 decades. And the honest answer keeps coming back the same way. It's complicated. Some studies suggest individual animals are dealing with real biological costs from living in a contaminated landscape. But here's what nobody predicted going into this. At the population level, none of that seems to be stopping them. Foals keep being born, herds keep growing. Whatever burden the radiation is placing on individual horses, it isn't outweighing the simple fact that, for the first time in decades, there are no farms plowing through their habitat, no roads cutting through their territory, and no people competing with them for land. One scientist who spent years measuring the trade-offs put it about as bluntly as you can. The benefit of humans disappearing seems to be outweighing the burden of the radiation staying behind, and the horses turned out to be just the beginning of something much bigger. As their herds expanded, the same forests and abandoned villages started filling up with species nobody expected to see in this part of Europe again. Wolves spread across the zone in numbers high enough that researchers now use it as a live laboratory to study how an apex predator behaves with almost zero human interference. European bison, animals that used to roam this exact region centuries ago, found their way back in. Even now, every camera trap that gets pulled from the field has the potential to capture something nobody's documented in this landscape in 100 years. But don't mistake this for some untouchable paradise. The zone has faced real threats since the horses arrived. Wildfires have torn through parts of the most contaminated forest in recent years, including areas the herds depend on. And the broader region has lived under the shadow of conflict that's made safe access and long-term monitoring harder than it's ever been. The horses are resilient. They are not invincible. Every herd you see in those camera trap photos is still being shaped by decisions humans made decades ago, and by risks no one can fully control today. And that's really the heart of what makes this place so strange to sit with. Chernobyl was supposed to be a symbol of permanent loss, a place defined by what disappeared. Instead, it's quietly become one of the clearest examples on the planet of how fast wildland can heal itself the moment it's given the chance, and how a species that vanished from the wild completely can claw its way back. Against odds nobody was confident about at the start. Nature didn't wait for permission. It just moved in. So the next time someone tells you a place is too damaged to ever come back, remember the horses of Chernobyl, running free, raising foals, and reclaiming a landscape everyone had already written off. If a story like this is the kind of thing that genuinely fascinates you, stick around. There's a lot more of the natural world quietly rewriting its own rules out there, and we're only getting started uncovering it.